Hello everyone and welcome to the next event in our series of In Conversation that runs alongside our exhibition programme. My name is Claire Gomez and I'm the Assistant Director at Workplace Foundation, which is a charity set up by Workplace Gallery to support underrepresented and emerging artists in the north of England. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm a mixed-raced cisgender woman. I have brown hair that's tied in a bun, I'm wearing a white wool jumper, and I'm in a white room with a bed in the background. This week, artist Nina Chua will be in conversation with co-founder and co-director of Drawing Room in London, Mary Doyle. Nina lives and works in Manchester. She studied at Manchester School of Art and completed her MA in Fine Art in 2011. In 2016, she was selected for the Liverpool Biennial Associate Artist Programme. In 2020, her work was selected for the Trinity Buoy Wharf Drawing Prize. Chua has exhibited nationally and internationally, including Nakata Museum, Hiroshima, Castlefield Gallery, Manchester, Baltic 39, Newcastle, DOX Centre for Contemporary Art, Prague, and Workplace Gallery in Gateshead. Her work is held in collections of the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester, Manchester Art Gallery, Manchester, the Centre for Artist Books at Dundee Contemporary Arts, and Simmons and Simmons Contemporary Art Collection. Mary Doyle has worked in the visual arts sector for over 30 years. She initiated Drawing Room with co-founders Kate McFarlane and Catherine Stout in 2000 and has co-directed the organisation since. Prior to this, she was senior curator at the Contemporary Art Society, leading on acquisitions of contemporary art for 15 museums throughout England from 1995 to 2005. She has worked at Arts Council National Touring Exhibitions, the British Council, and several commercial galleries in London. It is my pleasure to introduce Nina Chua and Mary Doyle, who will be in conversation this evening. Towards the end of the conversation, I will join and ask some questions. For now, I'm going to disappear into the background and operate the images. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So should I go next?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Nina Chua. I'm an artist. I'm currently sat in my mum's back room. If you can see in the background, there's some sparkly bits which aren't Christmas decorations, but just my mum's quirky sense of interior decor.
Thanks, Nina. I'm Mary Doyle. I'm co-founder of the Drawing Room. My pronouns are she, her. My ethnicity is white Irish. I'm wearing a blue sweatshirt and I'm sitting in my spare bedroom with an orange painting by an artist on the wall. Thank you, Claire, for your introduction. Make me feel very old. Yes, been around the block for a while, but it's very exciting to have this conversation with Nina. And very sadly, I wasn't able to make it up to her show. So we're talking about the works really in reproduction and online, which is always difficult when you're talking about works on paper, I think. But your show's just finished. And it looks absolutely beautiful. So I hope people got to see it. And if not, can see your work soon somewhere else. Yeah. Shall we just start talking with that? And then we're going to, throughout this, we'll see other works that were in the show. But so Nina, drawing is essential, is the core part of your practice, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I just wondered, because in this show, it's all works on paper using marker pen. And I just wondered why you choose to use marker pen as opposed to another, perhaps more traditional drawing materials usually associated with drawing.
Yeah, mainly because they're readily available and just so easy to get hold of. And there's something about the immediacy that allows, and I can go straight onto the paper and make a really vibrant definitive, clear mark on the paper using the permanent marker pens. And I think there's something about the immediacy that just is so fundamental to drawing for me, that you can just, just make a mark so quickly, and even spontaneously. And then as I've used marker pens for so long now, there's sort of particularities with the material, that like something like alcohol-based marker pens that bleed through the paper, and I've learned how to use them, and sort of, and I'm still learning what they do, and what I can do with them, and the sort of possibilities and the limitations that come with marker pen. So that's really become a sort of key aspect of the work now, I think.
And can you perhaps talk a little bit about the process of making your drawings, because there's a very specific process, and is it possible to see a larger image of a drawing, a more close-up image? That's great. Yeah, because it's very particular.
Yeah, well, I mean, the process, it's always marker pen on paper, but it does shift, and I do exploit different aspects of the paper and the pen, and also the marks I'm making. With this particular one, it's on A4 paper, just the kind of cheap A4 paper you just, you can buy a big pack of in printer paper. And then it's just sort of bog standard marker pens, and I've made horizontal lines on one side of the paper and vertical lines on the other side of the paper, which I think of as a kind of expanded grid. And it kind of, what happens is it kind of meshes together through the paper because of the bleed through of the pen. So in this particular drawing, it really exploits that, that aspect of the marker pen.
And so your choice of using that very thin, flimsy printing paper was in order to achieve that, or was that sort of, did it come about through a sort of accident in a way?
Yeah, I mean, my sort of work is all a sort of exploration of drawing and these particular materials, and so it comes about really through trial and error, and just, I'd say I spend probably an equal amount of time looking at what's happening as I'm making the drawing as actually doing the drawing. And so it's that kind of process of observing and then kind of trying to push it a bit further every time. So yeah, really this kind of work, it comes about through the process and the trial and error of making it.
But the process is very particular. You're not, are you setting certain rules or sort of instructions in order to make the work for yourself?
Yeah.
Or
sometimes, but it moves around a fair bit. So I could be doing one thing in one drawing and something that's almost like the complete opposite in another drawing. There is a kind of movement from one to the next, which is often the one prior triggers off a certain thought process, or maybe I've noticed something that I want to push a little bit further, and that might be the trigger for the next drawing. And now, after doing it for many years, I have a few sort of strands that I work on at the same time. But yeah, it does, there are parameters, but then after that I might set for myself, but then after a while I'll want to break that and sort of even kick against it. And so yeah, so it does move around a little bit.
And you were talking about how you actually make it with, it's not just, let's say, one marker pen, it might be Well, you said you want, there's a sort of sense of unpredictability in it, in literally the material that you're using. Can you explain how you use that material? Like the marker pen is used till it's run out?
Yeah.
Or?
Well, sometimes I use the marker pen. I try and use it until it completely runs out, which is takes longer than you might think, because there's always a little drop left in it. It always seems like I can eke out just even the tiniest little mark, but and then it becomes a kind of a sort of almost like an endurance, me trying to keep, push these things until they wear out, but it usually ends up that I wear out before them. Yeah, and then there's the paper aspect. So the paper as well, I use the paper in a particular way, which is, I think about it as more like an object rather than a surface to work on. So I think that's something that's probably particular as well in my process.
Okay. And there's a sort of sense of rhythm and repetition that you're interested in. That, I mean, when you look closely at the drawings, they almost look like they look like a grid, but they also remind me of things like Annie Alba's textiles, her pinpricks and her textile weavings in a way. Is there an interest in that sort of work?
Well, my background, I actually studied embroidery before I studied fine art, and then after I'd finished studying embroidery, kind of just wanted a complete break from it really, and tried really to kind of get away from any sense of cloth and stitch and all the sort of the sort of theories around that, and just really wanted a complete separation from it. And then had a sort of long break, and then went back to university and studied fine arts, and ended up with drawing, but somehow the textile background seeps into it. And I realized and accept now that I can't really, and maybe don't even want to, escape from it. It's just, it's so embedded in the way that I think, and so embedded in the way that I handle the paper. It's just kind of part of what makes the drawings particular, and part of their sort of what makes them what they are really. I can't get away from that textile way of thinking.
Because I mean, obviously when you were doing textiles, it was probably very sort of strict and formal way of working, and a system that you had to adhere to, whereas with this work you aren't necessarily setting out rules to work to, but there is an element of having to control something that's unpredictable, I guess.
Yes, I mean, just going back to the embroidery degree, it was very formal in the first year, and it got progressively in the second and third years sort of looser and less constrained by the traditional ideas of embroidery. So in the first year, we had to be there 9 till 5 every day, and we were doing hand stitch, samplers, machine stitch samplers. But then by the end of it, people were making sculptures out of coffee and quilts and elastic bands, and then it was the whole range. Some people were taking it into fashion and design, and other people weren't, like myself, weren't really using cloth at all anymore. But yeah, maybe that kind of discipline is there still in the work, that kind of sense of, and it's there probably in the way that I go to the studio and treat it like a sort of working day, and that sort of discipline, you know, of going there for a full working day and applying myself to something. Yeah, I think maybe it's there, but yeah. But I try and I think that the materials, the pen and the paper, shape the work as much as I do. And so sometimes they kind of confound any thoughts of what I might want to do, you know, often get disrupted by what they actually do, you know, and I have to tune into what it does. So the element of control is kind of like a sort of push and pull between me and what the materials want to do.
And so when you start something, do you have an idea of what you're going to do, or do you keep yourself really open-minded and just choose, like, how do you choose color, for instance? Is that your starting point, choosing a specific color? Or
not usually. Occasionally it is, but usually the color is very intuitive, and it's also determined by what's available, again, which I really like, you know, that sort of parameter outside of myself. You know, there's a range of colors that come in the marker pen and packs, so and I'm happy to stick to that and not to, yeah, the color, it's like one decision I don't have to make. I just often will just, and sometimes I don't put the cap and the ink don't correspond, so I put the wrong cap onto the pen, so I don't actually know what I'm picking up in terms of color, just to kind of disrupt it again. But yeah,
so you're interested in that idea of chance and potential and what can or can't happen, and you're sort of
I think it's just sometimes it not being coming down to my decision making or you know what, because I don't really start with a particular idea as such, you know, I don't really think, I don't know what it's going to look like when I start it. And it just kind of works out in the process, which I think the observing what it does, that's why it's so, I spend so much time just looking at what the pen does on the paper, so that I can kind of tune into something, you know, maybe something that's happened by accident or mistake or chance, that I can actually be sensitive to that. I think that's what the part I play in it, you know, is kind of having a sensitivity to what happens.
So your work moves from paper on the wall to these three-dimensional objects.
Yes, yeah.
How does that come about? How do you decide to make something two-dimensional versus three-dimensional?
So the first three-dimensional works I made were actually A4, like the one you saw in the first image, I think it was, or the second image. So they were the A4, what I called the expanded grid drawings. And there's just this temptation with the A4 that, you know, just this sort of really theatrical sort of movement, or you just want to scrunch it, you know, and throw it into the bin, you know, it's just that sort of size, that sort of, that you can just easily scrunch it in, and the sort of resistance of the paper is such that you can just crush it really easily. And then just this sort of a sense of, again, of I had made these lines. Those are probably the drawings that are the most controlled, the A4 ones. So I'd made that in a really controlled and methodical way. And just to have that disruption, you know, to scrunch, to crush it, and to disrupt what the lines are doing on the surface, and also to kind of change our relationship with the drawing, because, you know, it goes from this kind of flat thing, which we see at sort of eye level on the wall, to being a sort of small object, really. And I think that really sort of changes our relationship to it. So I was interested in that. So once I'd made several of the small A4 ones, I started to think, well, why not do it on a bigger scale? But that's, you know, but still put the work in, you know, still apply the pen to the paper. And then obviously when you scrunch it, you're going to lose a lot of information that's inside, crushed inside it. But all of those things became really appealing to me, you know, to make a drawing and to do that. And then also, you know, the physicality of kind of crushing the paper on that larger, sort of heavier scale, it's got a lot more resistance. And then, so that was the thought process. And then how I decide to make one is a bit sort of whimsical, really. I mean, sometimes it's the drawing doesn't work out as a flat drawing, so I try and see if it will work out as a crushed drawing. So that's one scenario. But then there's another sort of case where I just sort of I want to make a 3-dimensional drawing, you know, I've just got that in mind. And then I'm kind of almost looking for the drawing that will allow that to happen, you know, or where I think, I wonder what would happen to these marks that I've made if they were crushed and disrupted, or if the drawing needs to kind of, if I feel like I don't want all the information to be on display, then it's a kind of way, because marker pen, you can't erase it and you can't cover it. So whenever you apply a mark, it's always going to be visible for, you know. So sometimes I just feel like I've applied too much information and I want to kind of pull the information, I want to take it out, and crushing it is a way of doing that. You know, it kind of pulls the information back in, because I can't rub it out. So yeah, it's a kind of way of erasing it in some, I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that does make sense, absolutely. But it's interesting the scale as well, because they're actually, I mean, they're bigger than the A4, but you've in this show, you've placed them on the floor as if they're something that's discarded as well. In a way, they have been discarded from the wall to the floor, but because you've decided to crush them, and they take on another life. But they're very small and intimate, aren't they? These little things on the floor.
They are, and you know, I do show them on plinths as well, but it's
I suppose that changes its status, doesn't it? If you put it on a plinth, it suddenly becomes a sculpture and you walk around it. Yeah.
And whereas this is kind of, you might say, a bit more humble for it to be on the floor. But sometimes I like to see them on the floor sometimes, because they look so sort of orphaned. You know, just sort of like somehow just, I think the plinth ties them to a certain history of sculpture, and gives them a kind of gravitas maybe, which I find interesting, you know, to put a sort of crushed up piece of paper onto a plinth. I find that interesting in one way, but then to put it on the floor, I think kind of sets it free in this kind of, or kind of just, there's no anchor for it. It's sort of very singular, and it's just about your relationship. It does become more intimate, because it's about the viewer's relationship to the thing, and only the thing, you know, and, you know, almost like we're hovering over it, whereas the plinth brings it up to eye level. But when it's on the floor, you just sort of hovering over it, or you crouch down to see it maybe, you know. And so it is our sort of relationship, a sort of embodied relationship to it, is so different, and it makes you do different things in the gallery, I think, you know. Yeah. So.
And then in contrast to these little fragile discarded objects, you also make drawings on very large scale.
Yeah.
Let's see one of those. Yeah. So how are these made? I mean, they look incredible.
This one that's on the wall is one of the drawings I made that was where I was trying to run the pen out. So it's on a large scale because kind of that's what it took. And it, you know, I've still got a box of the pens from this drawing, which I've still got a little drop of ink left in them, you know, but it kind of needed to be on this scale to kind of push the pens to that point, you know.
And is it like a sort of, is it black and white, a black drawing?
Yeah,
is it?
Well, it is black marker pens, so it's only black marker pens, but then as they as I've used them, I've just repeatedly drawn lines. So I started on the right hand side and moved to the left, and then the marker pens just gradually wore out. So yeah, it's that kind of fade as the ink in the marker pen is running out.
Because it looks like it's just shimmering with, I suppose that black ink does look quite metallic as well. So
yeah, it once you've put lots and lots of layers onto it, it kind of gets a sort of glossiness, and almost you kind of see the undertones to the black. So sometimes there's a brown undertone to it, sometimes there's a blue undertone, and sometimes there's even a kind of reddish undertone to it. So that the sort of like layers and layers sort of brings that out. But then there's also a lot of movement. So because the lines are just drawn freehand, and they kind of you can almost see every stroke, I think, you know, but kind of it becomes a bit blurry, and so there is a sort of sense of movement that is me moving along the paper, but also the line sort of in this kind of watery sort of overlapping sort of wiggly vertical lines as well. So there's a kind of movement horizontally and vertically.
And you move from left to right. Are you left-handed?
Oh, I've moved from right to left, but
sorry, right to left.
Yeah, I'm right-handed, but
that's quite, you know, the way we read is from left to right. The way we read images is, or read, you know, words is like that, isn't it? So that's quite, I was quite struck when you said that it seems like the wrong way to go to me.
Yeah, I don't know. I think
you think you go like that.
I mean, I eat with my knife and fork in left-handed. I think, I don't know what it is. I do quite a bit of, yeah, I don't know what, I think.
Because your hand would
something that's evolved, really.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. I just wondered, was a particular reason. It's funny because it almost looks like more sculptural than the little piece in this image, anyway, more than the small piece on the floor. Yeah. It looks like a piece of steel, you know.
Yeah, it's actually because I allow the paper to curl, you know, I don't completely flatten it. And so because it's off a roll, so there's all, you know, to flatten it completely is, I feel like maybe a bit brutal, you know. It kind of takes away from its sort of what it naturally does, and I kind of like to just allow it to a certain point to do what it does, and you know, so it does curl up a bit at the sides.
So you're working with the physicality of the paper itself, the thread of it, the weight of it.
Yeah.
And it seems like quite a durational piece. I mean, like physically quite labor intensive as well.
Yeah, they can be quite labor intensive, and quite physical as well, because you have to sort of, the movement is sort of, you know, up and down in a very physical way, because the paper is 1.50 meters tall. So yeah. yeah.
So you're literally just reaching as far as your arm will reach, in a sense, and pulling it down.
Sometimes, yeah, because I need to elevate the paper so I'm not kind of bending down too
Yeah.
much every time. So yeah, sometimes it's quite high, so it is a bit of a stretch. It's not the full stretch, but it is. Yeah, but even things like that, I like, you know, I like to exploit that in some drawings as well. You know, what I am physically capable of, as well as what the material is physically capable of as well.
So can you tell us a little bit about your, do you title these works? Like,
I do, but they're all, so the titles of my work are always marker and then a number. So marker being not really relating to marker pen as such, but just this sense of marker as a marker of time, as a moment in time. So that's kind of how I think of the drawings, really, you know, as a sort of marker of that particular moment in time, in the sort of thinking process, in my life, in the exhibition, you know. Yeah.
And in this exhibition, you know, it's a big, nice white gallery space, but there's very few works. It's very sort of minimally hung,
Yeah,
which is really nice. It's not sort of full of stuff, but it gives room for things to breathe, doesn't it? From a large scale to the very small on the floor. Nina, can you talk about that, this wonderful, intriguing piece on the left-hand side of the image? If we can have a close-up of that, perhaps.
that one. Yeah. So this one is strips of paper, because you know the thought process with this is probably something along the lines of, oh, I've done something really big, can I do something really small, you know? So then the paper was cut it into little strips so that the actual surface of the paper is very, very small to work on, and then completely colored it in black. And then had these black strips that kind of got tangled up in storage, you know, as a transportation, they kind of got more and more tangled up. There's 3 strips here, and then in the end they became tangled up in a way that was really sort of satisfying for me. So I just thought, oh, that will be the work now. And you know, I think I went through a sort of stage where the marks were becoming a lot more not like more complex marks, so they're more loopy, more sort of curled up, and really, you know, almost like cartoonish kind of marks on paper. So I kind of like that this sort of curling loopy mark that was made just through serendipity, really. Yeah, I like that bit about it. Yeah, this kind of loopy mark.
And this is again marker on paper.
Yeah, it's marker on paper again. Yeah.
And so when you hung it, like you just found it almost like discarded in the studio, I guess, or getting tangled up. Did you untangle it to a certain tangle, or is it as you found it?
Yeah, it's as I found it, but it's really quite difficult to keep it. I mean, it's difficult to keep it now into this shape where it's become a satisfying sort of tangle. But you know, next time I open the box, it might be in a different configuration. But I think that's part of the work, really. You know, it's funny, like, to try and preserve these things, to try and keep them as they are is not impossible. It's a bit tricky, but then there's a kind of like, I don't know, something kind of nice, I think, about it. It's not sort of set, it sort of changes, and it shifts and moves, and and
it is a drawing in space in a way as well. a physical drawing. But it also reminds me of what you're talking about with embroidery, almost putting the needle through the material and then pulling it the other side, and the way that thread gets knotted so easily. So again, it for me brings it right back to the sort of starting point for embroidery.
Yeah, I think so. I just can't get away from it.
Got to use it. It's exciting. I was going to ask you about your, other artists that you look at or influences, and what because the work is quite abstract, and what about your references are not necessarily always that, are they? Abstract.
No, I mean, one of my loves are the Flemish primitives, which is very, very far from what I do. And but it's, I love looking at painting, really, in terms of drawing, I really like the drawings of Joyce Pensato. I really like those,
which are very, total contrast to your work.
Yeah, complete contrast. Yeah, but I remember seeing one where it was a drawing of Homer Simpson, and it was on a massive scale. But the sense of the body that was involved in that drawing, the lines just applied over and over and over and over and over again, and to such an extent that there was a hole going through the paper. So there was something about the kind of the involvement of the body, and then the sort of erosion of the material that really sort of appealed to some of my sensibilities. So it's sort of interesting, I think, that something that on the surface looks so different then can have this sort of, you somehow it can connect, and some it doesn't need to, like with the Flemish primitives, are just, maybe there's something about the intimacy of some of those images, it doesn't necessarily need to connect in a very direct way, but it just kind of, I just love looking at them.
Yeah. And I guess with what was I going to say? Sorry, I just had it up. I forgot what I was going to ask you. Oh yeah, I was going to ask about going back to the works on the wall, the two-dimensional paper works. You mentioned that you draw on the other side as well, the back and the front. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why?
Well, I think you've actually managed to, or you said it in a way before about the going back to the textile aspect, textile background, something about the way of thinking about line that travels through the material. So I think that's it probably comes from there, and also when you stitch, you turn the fabric over, so you're always looking at the back as well as the front. And I remember once one of my teachers told me, like, people often prefer the back to the front, but I think that sort of sense of it's not a surface, it's, for me, it is an object, so I turn it onto the other side, and then I think it does come from the embroidery background, really.
And the color also vibrates or reflects back onto the surface that it's hung on, doesn't it? Onto the wall.
Yeah, sometimes when there's a different color on the front and the back, and because I allow the paper to curl at the edges or just to sort of hang quite loosely, the color bounces back onto the wall. So I like not in some works for things not to be completely visible. Like I like the drawing to retain something for itself, so something that we as a viewer don't see, and maybe we'll never see. You know, it's this kind of something unknowable about it. So you know, I like the fact that we don't know what's on the other side of the paper, but the bounce back of colour gives a little hint of what might be underneath, or you know, in a tube, in a work that's in a tube or rolled form, freestanding. It's kind of like you can look over and inside it, and you might get a sense of what's in there, but you don't really know what's inside it. Yeah.
Which brings us really to this work, this almost sculptural piece in the middle of the gallery. Can you tell us a little bit about that, how it's made? And
yeah, I mean, it's covered in, it was made in the same way as the one in the background of this picture was made, so pinned to the wall and covered in vertical lines and that's on the front and on the back of the paper. So it's completely covered, and I just wanted to get it to be really as densely black as I could. And then it was stored in its rolled form, and I just thought it works in its rolled form. You know, there's something kind of like solid, but at the same time very flimsy about this paper sculpture. You know, and with it being black, it looks solid, but it's actually, you know, really quite delicate, depending on how you look at it, really, you know.
Yeah, it looks very like like a piece of steel or iron or whatever.
Yeah,
like a Richard Serra.
Yeah, well, this one, the marker pen I used for this one was one of these sort of outdoor, it was both alcohol-based marker pen, and then it was these sort of like heavy duty builders marker pens as well. So it does have that kind of you know, with the Richard Serra, the black repetitive marks on which were made out of sort of wax or some sort of heavy sort of melted substance that so it kind of has this a sort of thickness to it that some of his drawings have.
Yeah, it gives a sort of gravity to the whole thing, doesn't it? Weight.
Yeah, it gives a kind of sort of heavy dutiness to the mark, I think.
Yeah.
Know, kind of not a delicate mark, it's a kind of really sort of almost like messy, but really kind of thick substantial mark.
Do you know the work of Dorothea Rockbourne?
I don't actually know.
You should look at her. She was really interesting in the sort of 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
Working with paper, but almost physically the paper becomes almost sculptural, but it's still on the wall, sort of two-dimensional.
Yeah.
I think you might find her quite interesting.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So yeah, the paper's not just the ground for the drawing, which I think you're often talking about as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, the paper, and you know, I want to make a drawing that is just paper. But I haven't conceptually managed to sort of resolve that. But yeah, the paper is as important, I think. Yeah, it's not just a ground, like you say, it's something that really shifts and shapes the drawing and makes the drawing what it is, as much as I do or the pen does.
So is there anything that you'd like to say about the show that I have perhaps not brought up?
Well, I suppose from my perspective, I was surprised at how the drawings worked in the space and how much space they could occupy, you know, and that sense of them, you know, being discrete individual works, and the way that means that you know, people might look at them. You know, this and I think each of the drawings does something very different. You know, there's a kind of connection between them all in the materiality, but I think they do something, each one does something particular.
Yeah, it feels like that to me, and I'm not even seeing it in the flesh. Yeah.
But
and you're sorry, go on.
Yeah, just it surprised me really just how much space that you know that they need really. But in, you know, I think in this show anyway, that was the main thing for me.
And have you got anything coming up, Nina, in near future?
Yeah, I've got a show with Daniel Silver in Manchester at Castlefield Gallery that's coming up in the autumn.
Fantastic. An interesting pairing, you two.
Yes, I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah. But I'm interested in his work, so it's a great pairing for me. You know, it's like a real sort of good opportunity to spend more time with it and to think about his work and in more deeply, really, because I've, you know, been interested in it for a while. So it's a really exciting thing for me.
Well, if you both have in conversation, I'd love to hear it.
Oh yeah, thank you.
So most of the time you're just working away in the studio, making work.
Yeah, I mean, I've just moved studio because usually I'd be in the studio today, but yeah, we've just moved to a bigger space with a small group of artists in Manchester. So that's all underway at the moment, which is a kind of exciting new venture. And yeah, so that's kind of a big project that's been happening and taken up a lot of sort of time and energy, but it's sort of more or less up and running now. Yeah, so
great.
That will be few sort of tweaks and bits more of building the sort of infrastructure to make it sort of work exactly how I need it to work. And yeah.
Well, I hope it's exciting. Yes, exciting. Claire, you were muted, so
I realised. Yeah. Thank you both so much for such a detailed conversation. It was brilliant to listen to. Yeah, and there's lots of things that we can pick up on now and have a conversation between the three of us. Definitely. I was really interested in the difference between the works of 2D and 3D, and actually how the 2D works are really 3D in that sense, but in particular the column. When you look at it, if you look at it directly from the front of the gallery space, it feels really, really 2D, but then because it's not and it stands on the floor, it breaks the viewer's perception and kind of feels like this void going into a non-space. And I wondered if you'd kind of thought about that cross between the dimensions when placing and when making your work.
In a very simple way, yeah, because I always think of the tubes, the rolled works as like a line, you know, as a three-dimensional line. So there is this kind of, you know, just through the line, I think, and the same with the tangled up piece of work. You know, there's this kind of relationship between what happens in 3 dimensions and what happens in 2 dimensions on the surface of the paper. But what happened with the tube in this exhibition surprised me really, and it was, you and Miles as the curators of the show, it was really something that I think you brought out of the work and showed me, you know, that's the nice thing about it, is something that I feel so familiar with, I can get some distance on and look at it in a different way. So, you know, that sort of, and I think having the coming into the space and having that sort of long space between you and the work, and where the work is the first, the tube is the first thing you see, and you get that kind of that sort of sense of what is that, you know, this black thing, is it 2D, is it 3D, and the way that it sort of plays on your perceptions. Yeah, that was something that I hadn't really experienced before, so that's nice to have, yeah, something new, you know, for me to see it in that new way.
And there was only 5 works, is that right, in the whole show?
Yeah, just 5 works, which,
Yes.
you know, that's just the way, again, it evolved into this really kind of quite spare a show. But I think there's enough work in the show, you know, I don't feel like there needs to be any more.
They each hold their space.
Yeah.
And they all do quite different things.
Yeah.
Despite the medium being the same every time, they've each got their own kind of conversation that's going on. And they do hold that space, and they do need that space. And that was really interesting to go through when we were installing the show with Nina. Like, we'd brought up over 30 works with a look to decide which ones would work best, and it happened very intuitively. Good conversation between the 3 of us, which was really really good to go through.
I mean, I think there was one point when we were hanging the show where we took out a sort of large scale red drawing, so completely red, you'd think quite impactful, quite sort of visually impactful. We hung it onto the wall, and it just didn't hold the space as much as this small crumpled up thing on the floor. That kind of thing is really, it's so interesting for me, you know, to think how the 2 things come together, and you know, to sort of see something, just see how these things work in the space. You know, it's not always what I would expect, you know. Yeah, something sort of small and humble on the floor could hold its own much more than a big red drawing, you know.
Yeah, it just shows how you as an artist are so close to the work, especially within the studio, and how it changes the whole perception of the work when it's outside of the studio and it's you know, in a different environment.
And
no one could have told you that little crumpled up drawing is going to be better than the big red one, you know.
Yeah, and I think that's so important, you know, for artists to kind of get out of the studio and to put, because I think that until that happens, the work has never really been put to the test. You know, you think it does something, but you don't know what it does. You know, you just have to, and it is that opportunity that exhibitions allow to get a sort of distance on it, so that you can actually see it for what it is. I just don't think that that's possible in the studio. So yeah, it's a sort of important.
Lose that sense, the sense of control, almost, and the work speaks for itself.
Yeah.
And then maybe, like, talking about control, do you think that control, your control, changes depending on the size of the paper?
I don't know.
Fair enough.
Maybe, I mean, I think I said before, the A4 drawings are probably the most controlled, and so they are and they're the smallest drawings really that I make. So they're probably, but I think it's because they're really the only type of drawing that I do repeatedly. So I make A4 drawings, I just you know, have them sort of rolling all the time. You know, I'll often just sit down and, you know, spend a bit of time just making an A4 drawing, you know. But most of the other drawings I only really make one of, so maybe that's where the control aspect comes from, you know, the fact that I've made that type of drawing many times, and so, you know, then it becomes about the skill of controlling the line, but that only really happens in that particular sort of strain of drawings that I do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But then how do you choose the size of paper that you're going to work with on that particular drawing?
I mean, sometimes it's thought out, like, as in, you know, just through trial and error, I've worked out that if I want to run these marker pens out, it's going to need to be a big sheet of paper. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's purely pragmatic, as in, I only have a wall of 5 meters available, so, you know, it can't be any bigger than 5 meters, you know. And then other times it's just spontaneous, you know, just feel like I just want to cut a piece of the paper off, or you know, it might be just what's left of a roll. Mm-hmm. But I try and use all of the paper, you know. I try not to, and I don't try not to prescribe too much what the drawing will be, and just kind of use what is there, to, you know, to use really, and yeah, use it to its kind of fullest. So I don't like wasting bits of paper, you know. Yeah.
And when you're working on the artwork in your studio, you said that you pin it up.
Yeah.
And that's also how it gets exhibited.
Yeah.
And that's quite minimal in that respect. So does that leave space for the artwork to speak?
Yeah, I feel like when I've seen my work framed, it's too contained, you know. There's like it's like, and something of the delicacy of the paper is lost, you know, and something maybe of the objectness of it is lost. But then recently I've started to think maybe that is maybe it's something that's interesting in itself, you know, to kind of, because you couldn't really take it out and turn it over to see what was on the other side. So, you know, you kind of lose something, but then you kind of strengthen that idea that it's you know, that there's something that isn't available to you. Yeah.
And the thinness of the paper, you must see marks on the back anyway. Mm-hmm. So if it's in a frame and it's floated with quite a lot of space behind, you would get that. I think you would get that.
Yeah.
You would see the thread of the mark behind.
Perhaps. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those really difficult things. It's you know, it can either make a work, it has to be just right, doesn't it? So again, it's just a trial and error thing as how you can make it work for any given work. You know, it's it's a difficult thing to get right, I think. Yeah,
it is.
Yeah.
I think that's all we've got time for. But I just want to say thank you again.
Thank you.
To you both for such a wonderful conversation.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Nina.
Oh, thank you both.
Thank you, Mary.
We appreciate it.
Goodbye.
Yeah.
Thank you. Take care.